Aloha, good morning, everyone. It's great to see all the beautiful faces out there. As we get settled in, I'll introduce myself. My name is Jonathan Koehn, and I'm honored to serve as the director of the City of Boulder's Climate and Energy Department. I want to just say that our 60 minutes is going to go by really quickly, so I'm just going to jump right in. By the way, is anybody else in the denial phase of reading glasses right now? Because I'm really having issues with trying to figure out how to use these. So we're here, obviously, to talk about how utilities are working to deliver safe, reliable energy in a world where the risk of fire is no longer theoretical, but it's really constant. So as a bit of a disclaimer, we are not going to be able to go in too deep on this topic. We're really only going to scratch the surface on a number of the topics, and that's because I think in the wake of so many recent disasters, we're really confronting a number of hard questions about risk and about resilience, how our energy systems have evolved in the face of an increasingly volatile climate. And we all feel this deep sense of urgency to this topic because I think we've all seen what's at stake. Like I think many of you in the audience, and certainly my guests here, I come to this conversation not just as an observer, but as someone who's experienced the very real impacts of wildfire up close. And I've also seen the moral, the financial, and political consequences of when utility systems are caught off guard. And so I think we're all experiencing what I call this trifecta of intensifying heat, of drought and wind, and how it's making power infrastructure more vulnerable and communities more at risk. So if you were here last year, you might remember our keynote speaker, Catherine Blunt. She underscored the urgency for proactive resilience planning by utilities. And she concluded her remarks with a call to action to utilities. And now I would say that driven by multiple factors, we're seeing that utilities aren't standing still. They're moving facilities underground, they're hardening the grid, they are deploying AI to predict and prevent the next ignition. And probably most importantly, and I'm really eager to get into this conversation with you all today, they're working to rebuild trust with the communities that they serve. So I wanted to bring together three experts in this field to explore some tough questions. What investments truly make a difference, and how do we make that work? Second, how do we balance safety and affordability and cost recovery? I really appreciated the first panel this morning really talking about the growing number of competing priorities, and now we're adding another layer into the conversation. So this obviously gets more complex. So here's the plan for the next 60 minutes or so. We're going to start with some opening remarks from each of our guests, and then we'll have a more focused discussion. We'll leave some time, obviously, for audience questions. So be thinking about what you want to ask. You now know how to use that app and do the question feature. I suppose I should do some quick introductions so everybody knows who's up on stage. So we'll start in the middle. Mathew McNeff, Director of Maui County with Hawaiian Electric. Caroline, just to my right, Caroline Thomas-Jacobs. She's the Director of the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety with the State of California. And down on the end is Brad Rockwell, Chief of Operations with Kauai Island Utility Cooperative. So what I wanted to start with for the three of you, just to get the juices flowing a little bit, is just some opening remarks. Please feel free to talk more about your role in the space and why you're up here on this stage. So Caroline, I'm going to just turn to you because you just happen to be right to my right. You lead the state office responsible for energy infrastructure safety in what I would say is arguably one of the most wildfire-prone places in the world. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit what you've been doing in that space since you've been appointed to this role. What have been some of the biggest lessons or challenges you've faced in really aligning this idea of safety and resilience across such a vast and complex state?
Yeah, well, thank you, Jonathan. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all. Frankly, honestly, I wish I wasn't needed to be invited here. Wanted just to acknowledge that I'm here because of lives lost, right, here in the county of Maui, and that's really hard. I've lived through that myself in California now multiple times in terms of being a responder to those fires. As recently as the LA fires, I was just in LA on Monday touring Altadena with California Edison and talking through with them their wildfire safety. So just want to say, I really feel for all of you that have been directly impacted or indirectly, because I'm sure most of you, if not all of you here in Hawaii, have been in some way impacted, and it's a long recovery from such a trauma like that. So I guess I'll start with a little bit of how we got created, the department that I lead. So my role prior to the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety being created was I ran the State Operations Center for California and responded to all of these large-scale disasters in general, but wildfires in particular. And our department, it was born out of the tragedies of 2017 and 2018. So the California legislature passed some new legislation, and the Newsom administration signed it, that created new electrical corporation wildfire safety requirements for the investor-owned utilities in the state of California. And the main purpose of those new additional requirements, in addition to the Public Utilities Commission, we are a separate department from the Public Utilities Commission, was really to, and this goes to a little bit of what Chair Asuncion mentioned earlier this morning, it was about recognizing the need to create a new regulatory framework that would incentivize proactive investment in an expedited way to address this escalating and emerging risk, wildfire risk in particular. So the legislature, the legislation that created our office, and the main regulatory tool that it gave us was the wildfire mitigation plans. Many of you, if not all of you, probably are familiar with those. Many states now are starting to leverage those, including Hawaii. So the wildfire mitigation plans, our department reviews and approves those plans for the 9 electrical corporations in California. But I wanted to just mention that there is additional elements to that I think are really critical, and when I get into the other questions, I'll explain it a little bit more. But in addition to the wildfire mitigation plans, the new regulatory framework also created, we have oversight of ensuring the implementation of those plans, so that's really critical. It's not just a plan, we actually make sure the utilities implement the plan. And we also do annual safety culture assessments with each of the utilities where we then make recommendations. So it's not a requirement that they implement, but we make recommendations, and there's an incentive for them to agree to those recommendations, all with the purpose of trying to create a continuous improvement culture and cycle in the regulatory environment to really be able to drive expeditious development and improvement in capabilities to understand and address wildfire risk, utility wildfire risk within the state of California. And then the last piece of the regulatory environment was we also have, for some utilities that choose to do this, and I'll get into more of the details later in the difference here, but we also have responsibility to review and approve the executive compensation structures for utilities that choose to request a safety certification from us. And the key elements of that structure, and let me just be clear, we don't approve executive compensations of individual officers, but we look at the structure that the boards have set up of those corporations, and do they meet certain safety performance incentives in those compensation structures. So the whole purpose being, again, to incentivize the investment in improving safety outcomes. So all of those elements, the plan, the accountability to implementing the plan, the safety culture assessments, the executive compensation structure, safety performance incentives, all was put together to drive expeditious investment in improving safety outcomes within the electrical corporations in California. So to talk just quickly about the challenges and what we have found is, because we've been around now for about 5 years, is first and foremost, it's driven fundamental change among the utilities in California in terms of how they think about wildfire risk and how they approach addressing that wildfire risk. It has changed how they're organized in terms of their organizational structures. It's changed the down to the IT systems that they've developed within the organizations to be able to collect all the data, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, collect all the data and understand and use that data. It's changed their operations, how they operate the grid. It's changed how they maintain it. So it's fundamentally changed many, many work streams within the organizations, again, incorporating thinking about wildfire risk. But the biggest challenge, it's expensive, right? It's expensive. It does cause constraints on in terms of what can be invested at what speed, and so we can talk a little bit about that. But constraints on the affordability is the biggest constraint, and that there's still so much more to do, right? So it's not just that it costs a lot of money, but there's still so much more to invest in to truly get ahead of that risk. California's been doing it now for five plus years. We are, I would say, clawing our way back up the cliff, right, of being able to meet that risk, but we're not ahead of the risk yet. And that's a little scary to still think about.
So this is super interesting. So if I get this right, your role in your office is not the regulators. You're there to really facilitate and collaborate and help the utilities meet the requirements. I don't know if that's accurate. I want to come back to the important topic then of collaboration and facilitation, if you don't mind, here in just a minute, because I find that really interesting. I'd love to hear all of our panelists think about that topic. Matt, I want to go to you. Obviously, Maui has faced some extraordinary challenges with respect to wildfire in the last couple of years, and what I would love to hear you talk about is how has that challenge really helped shape the work that you and your team have been doing and how you've been approaching wildfire?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Again, Matt McNeff. I'm the director for Maui County for Hawaiian Electric. Born and raised on Maui, and you had mentioned wildfire safety strategy plans. Hawaiian Electric just submitted our revised plan to the Public Utilities Commission. Hawaiian Electric has always put the safety of our communities, our customers, and our employees as our highest priority. But we do realize that, the risk of wildfires is greater than it has been in years past. And with that realization, we put a lot of effort into wildfire mitigation. The wildfire safety strategy plan we submitted goes into details about all the things we're doing, including things like redesigning and hardening our grid, increasing our situational awareness, improving our operational practices, and of course, enhancing our customer and stakeholder outreach. There's a lot there. I can't go into all of the things, but just to highlight a few of the things you mentioned, implementation. Hawaiian Electric has deployed over 72 wildfire detection cameras across the 5 islands that we serve. 32 of those are in Maui County. We've deployed over 50 weather stations to try to understand what's going on from moment to moment in the different microclimates we have across the islands. About half of those are in Maui County. And, just based on the work we've done so far, we estimate that we've reduced the risk of wildfire from our infrastructure by over 60%. So I feel like we're focusing a lot on that. Every day we're working on wildfire mitigation. We also realize that, wildfire risk is a whole of society problem, and we're not going to be able to do it alone. It touches on aspects like urban planning, fuels mitigation, fire suppression. But we do feel like many of the actions that we have taken while focused on mitigating risk for our infrastructure will help to mitigate fires regardless of the ignition source.
Just a really quick follow-up before I go to Brad. I'm curious, have you thought differently about the speed and scale of the issue? Because I think you're getting into a really interesting topic about solutioning, tactics, and strategies. And what I have witnessed is that I think utilities are faced with this really interesting dynamic of we've had these plans and now we really have to accelerate them. And how do you deal with making those really critical trade-offs in terms of resources? And I'm just curious, have you witnessed or felt the same thing in terms of speed and scale and an urgency?
Yeah, definitely. We're much more focused on wildfires than we had been in the past, but I think that kind of helps with our resiliency overall. Beefing up our poles, that'll help in hurricanes or, strong winds. We've done things like we installed cover conductor to help mitigate sparks when wind-blown debris flies into our power lines. A lot of our new poles have fire mesh on them. So, as far as scale, Maui in particular has the majority of the high wildfire risk. A large percentage of our community is faced with that, and so we definitely feel the scale as far as Maui County.
Yeah, And I really like what you were saying about what I'm describing as no regret strategies. So you have multiple benefits from some of the strategy that you just talked about, and I think that's really important. Brad, I'm going to lob it over to you and ask you, I guess, a similar question, which is KAUC has been actively operating in wildfire-prone conditions for many, many years. So how has that risk evolved for you? And a similar, I guess, question that I asked Matt, how does it influence your operational planning today?
Hey, good morning, everyone. Brad Rockwell, Chief of Operations for Kauai Island Utility Cooperative. And yeah, I mean, I think our perspective is that the risk has increased. My own take on that, my own opinion is, you know, we see land use changes over the years. You know, large landowners typically used to have wide swaths of the island of Kauai in sugar, and those lands were being actively managed and monitored. A lot of water and irrigation was required for sugar, so water was coming to these lands. And as those lands have transitioned over the last 20 years out of sugar, 20 years plus, you know, we're now seeing more dry fields, fallow, unmanaged, things like that. And so there has to be a lot more collaboration in making sure that the risk of you know, an ignition starting is addressed both by the landowners and as us as the utility. We've had to frankly think about this a lot more now because, you know, the risk of ignition is greater when you've got an environment below the power lines that is more conducive to, you know, a fire spreading. I think we get a little bit lucky on Kauai sometimes because, you know, anyone who's flown in here to Maui knows the winds are always crazy and we're not quite as extreme with the geography and the topography. And so, frankly, as we saw what happened in Lahaina, we started to focus on wildfire risk quite a bit more and looking at technologies that could be of use to us, starting to implement a lot of weather stations ourselves because we realized the state infrastructure for weather stations on the island was somewhat inadequate. So we started putting up a lot more around the island so we could get real-time data to help inform our decision making. But mindful of the fact that we're a cooperative and we're always trying to ensure that we're not deploying, you know, too much capital investment so that our rates are going to go up significantly, but at the same time, just enough to address the risks and keep things safe and reliable in the way we deliver power. Striking the balance, that right balance, is always very important for us. And I think there's a lot of opportunity through use of technology because things like undergrounding, of course, is very expensive. So if we can use technology, as I said, more real-time monitoring from weather stations, employing drones has been something we've done a lot in the last few years where we're using LiDAR and high-resolution photos and infrared cameras to be able to get inspections of our utility infrastructure much more frequently and much more in detail so that we can get our crews out to address those problems quickly has been important for us. And then pole inspections of our wood poles and doing things like that. We've been able to dramatically increase our amount of inspections that we're doing and getting pole change outs through more quickly around the island. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's hopefully a little opener.
So I want to create a little bit of a thread from what you just said in terms of strategies, and I'm going to abuse my moderator role just a little bit. I'm going to ask the three of you a question and maybe ask each of you to respond to this. And it's picking up on something you said, Caroline, which is this idea of collaboration. And so I would love to hear a little bit about how important is inter-island collaboration on wildfire issues and perhaps mainland collaboration on wildfire mitigation. And maybe do you see opportunities for improvement, opportunities for shared learning? Across utilities, I guess is what I'm getting at. Does that happen? I don't know. And so I'd just love to hear you all talk about that. It seems like it would be a smart thing.
So maybe I'll start and just give a little bit of the background of how that's developed within California. So if I go back to 2017, so right, even before the Camp Fire in Paradise, there had been some fires, and we were starting to have conversations with the utilities. They were coming up with the concept of the public safety power shutoffs, right, to proactively de-energize. At the time, I was over at the Office of Emergency Services for the state, overseeing the State Operations Center, and my role was the state's liaison to the utilities to think through, like, how would we respond if they proactively turn the power off. As an emergency manager, our very first question to them was, well, are you guys talking to each other, right, to like plan this and really think through the operations and do all this? So right from the beginning, whether it was in that role or in my current role, we have been saying, let's make sure that you're doing, that you're talking to each other about how to approach this so that we're not each individually having to learn these lessons, right? So how that evolved over time was, and this frankly isn't even like a direct critique of the individual utilities, it was just that it wasn't culturally in their DNA to do it, so it took a little time to make it happen. But we kept pushing that idea. Meet, talk about the topics, whether it's veg management, risk modeling, grid operations, how you run PSPS, how you run fast curve, or whatever you guys call it here, fast curve, enhanced power line safety settings. We have all sorts of different names for it, basically, fast trip. Talk to each other. So we started through our regulatory role within our reviews of the wildfire mitigation plans. We implemented this concept when we had reviewed the plans and issued decisions approving them. Once they got to a place where we could approve them, we would include areas of continued improvement. So we call them ACIs, areas of continued improvement. So we issue a decision saying this plan's approved, but we know you're going to submit a plan next year. Here's where we want you to improve. And so that we used the regulatory structure to sort of drive collaboration by creating ACIs that required them to meet. And in the beginning, it was they met because we required them to. But now, it has now evolved to where they're meeting because it's really productive, right? And the individual operational teams are meeting with each other to share ideas, to share resources, to share data even. So for example, on Monday, I was meeting with California Edison, and they were talking about how they're, when it comes to asset maintenance and the imagery that they're getting from all of the inspection, the new ways they do asset inspections, they're starting to think through how can we share this imagery so that we can all train our models on a larger base, knowledge base, right, a larger database, so that we can leverage and train faster, train the AI models faster. So there's a lot of opportunity to be able to continue that, and I know that at least they tell me, that they're starting to try and bring that to the broader community in the industry. But it's been an evolution, and I think that we're starting to see the value now of those collaborations.
Matt, you want to jump in on this?
Sure. So I can say without a doubt for Hawaiian Electric, across the 5 islands we serve, we collaborate on wildfire safety every day, without a doubt. And KIUC calls in, we have a wildfire safety group that KIUC is a part of. So, I think that covers inter-island. We realized that a lot of the mainland utilities had a sort of like years of more experience than us on this, and we weren't really willing to wait all those years to get up to speed. So we collaborate with all the utilities in California. We call into their monthly wildfire safety meetings. We've had like sort of symposiums over here that they attend to. We attend their symposiums. We've talked to Portland General, Puget Sound, Xcel Energy. Just basically trying to understand how we can get better, what pitfalls can we try to avoid, just trying to get, you heard Shelley mention it earlier, that Hawaiian Electric's aim is best-in-class wildfire mitigation, and collaboration is definitely one of the tools that we're using to get there.
Sure, and I'll just, to not repeat what's already been said, the other part of collaboration, I think, is just within the island of Kauai with our partners and stakeholders. So the Kauai Emergency Management Agency, the other utilities, the other large landowners, and so that we all talk to each other. When something happens, then it's much easier because you've already been talking to people. Everyone knows each other, and we're a little fortunate because we are a little bit of a smaller community, but we pick up the phone and talk to each other. And we had a great example of a wildfire last summer that was caused by some vehicle ignition over on the west side, and just very quickly we were able to implement, de-energizing the transmission lines as the fire was approaching the highway, and we were able to utilize a solar and storage project on the far west side that has a microgrid capability. It's able to run as a grid forming inverter and keep some of the loads on the other side powered during that fire until it was put out. So we were actually operating 2 separate grids while we did that. And while it wasn't perfect, it was a pretty cool like proof of concept that, yeah, we can do more and more of this. Just need to have that collaboration and forethought.
Brett, I want to stick with you and kind of pick up on the collaboration piece. And obviously, as a cooperative utility, I'm curious, I want to bring in some of the comments from a few of you. You started with this idea that, yes, it's incredibly expensive to think about wildfire hardening. And I'm curious, Brett, if you could talk about how do you work with your members to prioritize and understand risks and trade-offs with respect to things like, undergrounding or veg management. And I just say this because, in my community, a lot of my community members just say, we just need to underground everything. And well, it's called Boulder for a reason. I mean, it's very, very difficult to underground our power lines. So the question becomes, what is the problem that we're really trying to solve? And is that the right tool that we should be using? Or should it be more wildfire settings or more PSPS or more veg management? I'm just curious how you interact with your members to talk about those issues and those potential trade-offs and costs.
Yeah, well, I think the most basic way we do it is just because of our structure. As a cooperative, the residents of Kauai own the company. They elect our board of directors. So we have this very organic need to make sure we're responding to the community. So they elect our board. The board sets governance for us as staff, and then we go out and execute it. But we have many ways to communicate with the membership. I mean, they can attend our monthly board meetings. They can provide public testimony. We have a number of different groups that we reach out to and stakeholders throughout the community. Like I said, collaborating with the large landowners and with the county, and just getting these inputs as far as what we need to be focused on. That said, a lot of times the technology side of things can be a little challenging for some parts of the community. As you said, everyone just wants to say, yeah, let's just underground everything. Well, there's a lot more detail involved in that. And so we focus on some other things as well as undergrounding, like, extra sensitive relay protection settings and, also power isolation, what some people call PSPS. We've tried to kind of avoid that term there because it's a little different from how it's employed in California just due to the nature of our grids here in Hawaii. And like I said before, just using technology.
And I think I'm really interested in learning more about your experience from the perspective of, well, I'll just share an experience, and sorry, I'm going to use the term PSPS, that occurred in Boulder. It got people thinking about critical facilities and understanding other alternatives, whether it's, we always jump to microgrids to solve everything, but in this instance, is there an opportunity to really think about isolating parts of the grid around some of our critical infrastructure? What would that look like? How do you pay for that? How do you implement it? So I think there's a really great lesson to learn from the work that you've been doing in some of that space. I'm going to pop back over here a little bit because something you said earlier in your opening remarks about data, and I'd love to maybe pick at this a little bit. How do you see utilities really evolving their use of data in this space? I think that's a really important one. And does your office have a role in setting protocols or some expectations around the use of data?
Yes. So when the state passed Assembly Bill 1054, which created our office and created this new regulatory framework, which was fundamentally different than a traditional regulatory framework, it added some additional specificity to what needed to be in a wildfire mitigation plan, including the utilities needed to include performance metrics. So it opened up this idea that, okay, when you submit a plan, you also have to back up and justify how you're understanding your risk and addressing that risk with data. So that was a huge a learning curve and uplift of how in the regulatory environment, we use data to really push the utilities to address this risk. So we created in 2020 an initial data requirements for the utilities. What data, what level of specificity, what's the attributes of the data. And in the beginning, frankly, the utilities were like, hey, we don't even have this data. We can't fill out your spreadsheet. So we actually gave them a few years to build out the capabilities to be able to collect that data and organize it the way that we sort of created some standards around within the state. And now there are specific requirements. And so what we found with that is a couple of things. One, and I had one utility executive say to me just a couple of years ago when I was talking to her about all this, she's like, I had no idea how much addressing wildfire risk meant investing in my IT systems, because they literally didn't have the capacity, they didn't have the sensor networks to be able to collect the data, and they didn't have the IT infrastructure to store the data and the software to analyze the data. So there was a learning curve there that we are now, I would say, obviously there's going to be more investments in that, but we're starting to really reap the benefits of 5 years of investments of building up that capability. So, and I'll just give one really specific example. One of the things that we required early on in our evaluations of the plans in veg management was adding species to the tree inventory that the utilities were some of them were at different levels of what they collected about their trees, or even if they had a tree inventory. And we said, you need to do that, and you need to understand the species so you can start to analyze which trees do what under what conditions and potentially hit your infrastructure and cause sparks. A lot of resistance, frankly, in the beginning because it was scary. Well, now we need to change our IT systems to be able to capture this level of information. We said, do it anyways. They did it. Now what they have is they have multiple years worth of data to be able to analyze and have more data-driven evaluation of effective veg management under different conditions so that they can be smarter about how they do veg management on the grid. And then that goes to affordability, right? Don't cut stuff just to cut stuff. Cut stuff so that you can reduce the likelihood of an ignition. So that's just one specific example, and we're even finding now that data can be used for other information. It's not just wildfire resilience, right? It's going to be informing, and again, this was an Edison example. They're using LiDAR data that they collected in wildfire mitigation to then inform their integrated grid planning. Because now all of a sudden they're able to use that information to understand the distinct loads in specific spans of their distribution system that they didn't know the ebb and the flow of that load, because of the way that it's distributed. Now they do, and they're able to understand the potential load growth needs of that particular circuit or segment. So the wildfire investments have exponentially increased the capability of the utilities to be able to address a number of different issues, but particularly wildfire.
So something just came to mind as you were talking about that, and it goes back to the earlier question about collaboration. So I'm just going to give you an example, and I would love to give the two of you an opportunity to talk about data too, but I'm just going to insert this. It's not just about data and sharing of information between utilities, but I think there's a real strong desire to share that information with communities too. So as I think about the role that we play in our building codes, in our planning codes, in our vegetation management, landscaping, we're going through that in real time right now. And we run into these pain points, for example, this non-combustible zone between 0 and 5 feet that's just no vegetation whatsoever. And we've learned a lot from the experience in California that a lot of deciduous trees actually deflect embers. So we don't want to increase heat by just putting in rockscaping. And to the last speaker's point, how do we use nature in ways that are really compatible with this risk? So a little bit of a segue, but I'm just thinking about the flow of data and collaboration as more than just utility to utility, but how we use that information to really think about addressing these bigger risks. Matt and Brad, I'm curious if you have anything you want to share to this question of data. If there's anything, you don't have to. But. Go ahead.
Well, I think obviously the more information, the more inspections you do, the more weather stations you have out there is just more data, right, coming in. We haven't necessarily seen that it's exceeding our capacity. And you know, as I was listening to Caroline, I'm thinking, why is that? You know, maybe because our grid is small and we got fiber. It's easy to connect everything via fiber. So we have, you know, security cameras and video already at our substations that we're monitoring and bringing back all the time. And that might be something that maybe it's just not, you know, something that investment in California, they didn't think about doing that with certain utilities because it's way more spread out, way larger area. But, you know, we have some benefits and some disadvantages, I guess, by being a small grid, and maybe that's one of them. One advantage that, you know, we are small, we can string fiber around everywhere, and we can get huge data transfer very easily.
Yeah, I guess related to data, just going back to the sort of weather stations that we deployed and the fire cameras. I mean, those were all devices that we didn't have 2 years ago, right? So that's 50 plus weather stations that now we understand what the weather is doing one gulch or one valley from the next that we had no visibility to prior. And I think all that data can be used both to make sort of like real-time decisions, but then also to sort of feed future models so that we understand how the weather and how winds propagate and how that might affect fire, performance or behavior.
If I can add into that, yeah. So when I first got involved in all of this in 2017 in California, going back to the weather stations and cameras, because weather stations I think is where it all starts. Honestly, you can't understand your risk or do anything about it if you don't know what's happening in the weather in that particular canyon. So the level of specificity and granularity and frequency of monitoring of that weather station, vital to all of it. It's foundational to everything. And we had, less than 1,000 weather cameras in the entire state of California in 2017, weather stations. I think we had less than 50 cameras. Now we have over 2,500 weather stations, over 1,000 cameras. And San Diego Gas and Electric, I think, is saying that they're pretty much saturated in terms of where they could put weather stations. So that is fundamentally critical to being able to understand wildfire risk and do anything about it. Because it's not, I would say, not just the location of the weather station, the quantity, but also the frequency. So what we found is that, the National Weather Service weather stations were doing like 30-minute reads. Well, when you're trying to make a grid operational decision around public safety power shutoffs or proactive de-energization, whatever you want to call it, 30 minutes is not nearly granular enough. So then they went to 10 minutes. But then 10 minutes wasn't even enough. And now our utilities are at 30-second reads under certain conditions because they need to understand whether it's a gust or sustained wind, right? When they're making a very specific operational decision on whether to turn that power off and potentially de-energize tens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of customers. So again, just wanted to reiterate sort of the significance of the importance of weather stations in understanding wildfire risk across the board.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. I'm going to take a little bit of a left turn, just prompted, I think, by something you said, Matt, so I'm going to come back to you with this question. And it connects back to the issue of cost. And I think we all know that there are significant investments, and obviously those investments will be shouldered by ratepayers. But there's this, I think, insidious impact also, which is insurability, which is really having an effect on more vulnerable populations. And so, Matt, I'm going to ask you, maybe if you could talk about how do you communicate, how do you work with your customers that are perhaps more rural, more vulnerable, and how do you work with them to understand wildfire risk and the role that the utility and they can play in solving some of the challenges?
Sure. So I think we take a varied approach to our community outreach. Just last year, we had over 100 sort of like outreach events alone. We have both on one extreme, maybe like a emergency preparedness open house, where we gather up all our partners, being Maui Fire Department, Maui Emergency Management Agency, Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, have them all in one place, and the community can come learn about the things we're doing to mitigate wildfires, but also get information from these other organizations on how they can protect their families and their houses, and sort of all of us together mitigate the risk. And then we also do more tailored things where we go to, say, community association meetings where people are already having standing meetings, and we talk about the things we're doing there. We also go to small community events, maybe that are already occurring, like the Pineapple Festival on Lanai. We'll have people there talking about things that they can do for emergency preparedness and help preparing their family. So we try to cover it across the board. I mean, in extreme situations, we have gone door to door if we need to do that to reach folks. And we work with organizations like Kaunoa to reach Kapuna. So whatever it takes, we're trying to get out there and spread the word on what people can do to help mitigate wildfire risks and just prepare for emergencies in general.
So it sounds like the work you do fits into those, what I just described as the three buckets. There's the preparedness, there's the response, and there's the recovery. And so you're actively working in all those spaces. Does that include things like evacuation and help people understand evacuation plans?
I mean, some of those things are done by our partners. Like, I'll give you an example, Maui Emergency Management Agency. They just sort of launched their Genesis Protect evacuation app. It's an app you can download on your phone, and it'll kind of track 5 of your favorite places as well as where you are now to tell you whether there's evacuation in place and where you need to head to. So they come to our events and they educate the public on those types of efforts.
Got it. Brad, you want to say anything on this topic?
Oh, very similar. I mean, yeah, pretty much nodding my head at everything Matt was saying, but that we do as well.
Okay. Then I'm going to, Carolyn, I'm going to come back to you. And it was a question that I started to get at with the concept of speed and scale. And I would just say I'm curious how California is really balancing the rapid response need, so that's the speed piece, with that systemic change in how utilities approach risk. And so how is your office really thinking about that? And are there things that you could learn from how these two have been operating? And I'm just kind of curious for you to talk about.
Sure, yeah. So when the Assembly Bill 1054 passed in 2019, that then created us in 2020, one of the things that it did was it added, and I'm going to use a term that it might be a California term, so I'll just explain what it is. But so it added what's called a memo account at the Public Utilities Commission, which allowed the utilities to immediately make those investments that were in the plan. And then charge them against the memo account outside of their general rate cases. So it basically created an expedited path for the immediate investment. The idea being we need to be able to give an expedited path right now. So now we're 5 years in, and the question is, how do we want to managing affordability and really trying to ensure that there is a sustainable approach to this? The question is, do we keep that approach or do we evolve it? During the 5 years, so 20 to 25, what we did in our reviews, our department was really created to do a hyper focus on risk reduction, right? So I just want to be really clear, the California Public Utilities Commission was the one that still managed sort of the cost effectiveness element of this. We were focused on risk reduction. But within that, we wanted to make sure that any investments they were making in those 5 years, we really had them focused on in a risk prioritized way. So in the review of the wildfire mitigation plans, we would require them to articulate their risk models and literally rank all of their segments of their circuits. And then we would say, okay, now of all the different mitigations you're doing, how are you prioritizing those mitigations against these risk ranked segments within your circuits? So we really wanted to make sure that they were addressing the highest risk as fast as possible and as operationally feasible as possible. So that's what the last 5 years has been. And now there's a proposal, because we're in sort of the next 5 years of really trying to think through this. The legislature, there's a bill that's working its way through the legislature right now, so we'll have to see whether it passes or not. But that bill would sort of adjust our wildfire mitigation planning process to get in front of the GRC. So instead of there being a after-the-fact review within the commission in terms of the investments made in wildfire mitigation plans, it would be a proactive review of those investments proposed in the wildfire mitigation plan prior to spending the money. So we're looking at the order of operation to try and help make sure that there is an appropriate cost-effectiveness review in those investments.
Mm-hmm. So, Brad, something you said earlier, and I know we're all over the place with the questions, but Sorry, it's my indulgence, right, as the moderator, get to do this. One of the things that I've learned a lot about over the last couple of years is this issue of mutual aid. And I'm curious, and I guess this could be a question for both of you, as you think about the added risk of wildfire. In a place like Colorado or in California, obviously mutual aid is available. I think it's more readily available. And so how do you think about the planning of mutual aid issues in the face of wildfire risks?
It's certainly more challenging on an island because, you know, every bit of aid that comes in from the outside has to fly here or, you know, get it shipped, most likely come on a ship or a barge. So when you think about natural disasters, whether it's wildfire, hurricane, whatever, on the continental grid, once, you know, the disaster clears, trucks are just driving in. You know, they're setting up man camps and, you know, they've got thousands of workers and there's any number of, you know, contract companies, storm chasers that can come in and rebuild the infrastructure very quickly. Here we think about it differently. You know, our goal at KIUC is to basically try to have like a month's worth of equipment, poles and transformers and things like that, because by the time we can get a ship loaded in here with significant amounts of equipment, you know, we're thinking that's about a month out. So we try to make sure we can always fly crews in, but getting the vehicles, getting the poles, getting the transformers is going to take a while. Now that said, we do have a number of mutual aid. You know, we have mutual aid with Hawaiian electric companies. So, you know, hopefully in the event of a natural disaster, you know, we're only looking at one island getting primarily affected, then all the other islands can help. That's going to be our quickest level of support. And, you know, we're a little fortunate in that relationship because we're much smaller than them. So, you know, the amount of aid we can provide to them is probably a lot more limited than what they could help us with. So we're thankful and mindful of that. But we also, and they as well, are part of Western Region Mutual Assistance Group. So that's mainly all along the western part of the country, utility companies. And so we're involved with them. Anytime there's a disaster, there's a call, we're on that. So we have the ability to request through that. We also have mutual aid through our electric cooperative network. And one unique thing about being electric cooperative is that we are eligible for FEMA reimbursement. So that's kind of a huge risk mitigation factor as far as cost when it comes to, you know, rebuilding after a natural disaster that we're lucky to have as an electric cooperative.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That's really helpful to know. And I just want to, it was an important one for me to get out there because I know it's been something that we just say, oh, well, we always have somebody there to help. And I was just curious how you all address that. I want to pivot again just a little bit and then, how are you all doing out there? Everybody okay? Okay. All right, there, I heard a whoop. Make sure, I'm going to get to some audience questions here in just a second, so if you haven't, go ahead and use the app and we'll ask our guests some questions. One of the things that I just want to bring into the conversation, and probably not for a response unless you really want one, you know, I think wildfires become this ubiquitous cover story for climate change, and communities are really thinking differently about how they recalibrate their relationship with nature, quite frankly. And at least in my community, there's a lot of discussion about how we bring all of the voices to the table. Utilities are only one of those. So this is my comment earlier about land use planning and how we harden our own systems, but part of that is really thinking about that relationship with nature. And I raise that because I think we often fall into this trap of saying that we just need to address carbon, but carbon follows water. So we're thinking hard about how do we rehydrate our soils, how do we think about fire and water-wise landscaping. So it's just a piece of it, and I encourage you all to just always remember that there is such a connection there, I think, to the land and such a connection to working with local programs besides just thinking about how do we harden our systems to prevent wildfire. Obviously, that's a big piece of it. Go ahead, you were going to say something?
I'll talk a little bit about how California is trying to do that.
Yeah.
So a few years ago now, the legislature created Wildfire Mitigation Advisory Committee, which is run by our state fire marshal, and it has a number of representatives from cities, counties, the insurance industry. My department represents the utility sort of sector role in that, a number of other state agencies. And the whole idea of having a public body that is discussing and talking about, let's call it, all the different roles, I think you mentioned that as well, that in addressing wildfire, is that it's not just utility caused, right? There's a lot of other things that can cause it. And frankly, in California, like wildfire is a natural part of our landscape. We're going to always live with wildfire. So that's one body that we've created to try and have that broader conversation. But then we also have a California Wildfire and Forest Resiliency Task Force that's run by our Secretary of Natural Resources and the Region 5 U.S. Forest Service Regional Forester. So that's our region, Region 5, at the U.S. Forest Service. And that is a larger body that I would say basically anyone that touches wildfire or forest resilience participates in these task force meetings, which are really like mini conferences, really. And the state has an action plan, and how we've integrated utilities into that is it just was released, I think it was January, maybe early February, the updated action plan, and it has 25 specific actions. We have action number 10, our department, and that is for us to coordinate development of a utility resiliency partnership program, the whole point being to create an environment for utilities to come into that conversation in the larger forest resiliency conversation so that we're amplifying and directing utility investments alongside state and local and other nonprofit investments in forest resiliency and climate adaptation.
Yeah, very cool. Y'all want to get to some audience questions? Sure. All right, let's do it. It strains my credibility to say that I'm actually on time, so I'm really happy. I'm usually totally off base. All right, so I'm gonna ask a couple that I think are not specific to any of you, so feel free to jump in if you have a response to this. I'm gonna start with this one, and maybe because I think it's on top of a lot of people's minds, it is this question about this risk of public safety power shutoff. So like you said, it was we're not going to use that acronym, but we're just going to say it anyway. So how do utilities manage the downstreaming of risk associated with PSPS? I think there are critical providers that now must invest in backup power that may not necessarily be clean. Interesting. Thoughts?
I'm happy to kick us off. So how California addressed that, the Public Utilities Commission, just to understand the roles and responsibilities, the Public Utilities Commission has oversight of how the utilities choose to use, I'll just use proactive de-energization if you don't want to use PSPS term, it used to be called that. They oversee sort of the utilities' use of that as a wildfire mitigation. We evaluate it as an approach to mitigating wildfire risk. So we don't oversee the actual implementation of an event, of a PSPS event. But so the PUC, they created guidelines, call them regulations really, of how the utilities had to approach deciding and then executing that event. So they included several customer notification requirements. They included coordinating with critical facilities and critical industry. They included collaboration with locals that you were talking about earlier. So they created a bunch of requirements that then they go back, and after each event, the utilities are required to submit a report where the commission then looks at that report and says, okay, did you meet all those requirements of that executing or implementing that particular event?
Mm-hmm. Brad, Matt, anything to add on that one?
Just similarly, I guess, we do a lot of education around PSPS. And of course, PSPS is to avoid a catastrophic wildfire. We try to get out there and have people, anyone that might have medical needs that are dependent on electricity, to let us know. That we'll call them, we'll text them, we'll send out emails in the event that it's looking like we're headed towards a PSPS. And then maybe things that would help in PSPS, but also just disasters in general that, we're looking at critical customer hubs. I think you're going to touch on it before, and getting grants to fund those things. So hopefully that would help ease the burden on communities that may be impacted by longer term outages.
Mm-hmm. Anything?
No, I think that's good, thanks.
Okay, well then I'm going to go to a question I think is going to be for the two of you. And it has to do with data, and I'm just going to read part of the question, but it's really around AI, technology, and how do we process data. So the question is, how can we best use the advancing technologies to assist our development or even planning communication between islands? So the question then is around kind of using AI, using technology that maybe isn't being utilized today.
I'm not sure it's totally in response to that question, but we do use AI. The wildfire cameras do use AI to detect a certain amount of smoke rise for any fires. Once they do that, they automatically send sort of notifications to Maui Fire Department, Maui Emergency Management Agency. So that is incorporating AI. The system does exist across all the islands. Is that too much of a stretch for AI across islands?
I didn't ask the question, so I think it was perfect.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot. I mean, admittedly, I don't think we're using a lot of AI at this point in that. I mean, I'm familiar with those cameras. We have not deployed those on Kauai. You know, the county may choose to, or the state, because, you know, we see our role as a utility as preventing an ignition, not necessarily reporting where fires are and things like that. I think there's other entities that are better suited for that.
Cool. I'm going to cut you up because you have a specific question.
Oh, okay.
And I'm going to use our time to answer, because I think this is a great question. Sorry. So this is a question for you. At the beginning, you said that California specifically is not ahead of the wildfire risk. Do you remember saying that? I do. Okay, perfect. So the question is, what are the main things you think are critical to get ahead of it, and when will that be a reality?
I'll just say I can't answer that in terms of when we'll be ahead of it. But what I mean by that is it's an escalating risk, right, that is continuing to get worse. And so the first and foremost, when I came into this, and again, I came from outside the utility industry, right? I was an emergency manager and kind of came into this utility space. Frankly, I was a little surprised, and this is not a critique of the industry, because I mean, I'm in government, like we're always behind the game too in different things. But in terms of the adoption of modern technologies, I was a little surprised of what hadn't already been developed, right? So it was wildfire forced us to quickly, and I'll use the sort of global us, to be able to create certain capabilities, to use modern technology to even understand what the risk is. I do think California, especially the large utilities, have a decent understanding of what the risk is. That's the first step. The second step is developing all the different mitigations and approaches to addressing that risk, and I think that we're well on our way of being able to address that risk. I think that getting ahead of it isn't being able to anticipate the risk writ large. There's always, I mean, you know, you look at any industry, high risk industry, there's always going to be the outlier chance that a bad thing can happen, right? We're never going to be able to avoid every single potential ignition. But I do think as an industry that given modern technology, and I think all this technology exists now, it didn't necessarily all exist 5 years ago, but I think that it's being created now to be able to anticipate the risk and then build certain mitigations so that whatever the risk is, whether it's human error, something breaks, something new happens, having fail-safe mechanisms to be able to respond to that. That's where I think we need to get to as an industry, and that the regulatory environment needs to help support getting to that place of being able to fail safely.
Very cool. Okay, so I'm going to transition pretty quickly because we just have a couple minutes. So for the closing, I'm going to ask each of you to offer, I'd say you have about 45 seconds to a minute. So content of your choosing. Any message of hope? What's one idea you want to make sure that the audience leaves with today? Could be a song, haiku, interpretive dance, Matt, if that's what you're into. It's totally fine. You want to start?
Sure. I guess message of hope, I mean, you know, my own personal opinion is as a utility engineer and someone who's worked in the business a long time, I think it's important to recognize that what happened on Maui was an extreme weather event, and I think that if the same set of conditions were to happen today, you'd have a very different outcome. We're all very dialed in. We have a lot more real-time monitoring, as Matt said. I mean, I think unfortunately, sometimes some very hard lessons are learned through events like that. But so I'm always mindful of wanting to swing the pendulum so far now that we spend so much money, increase everyone's rates for a problem that if it happened again, the result would already be different. I think we've already sort of figured out a way to mitigate that.
Thanks, Brad. Matt?
Yeah, I guess one thing to leave everyone with was, you know, I mainly talked about how Hawaiian Electric and what we're doing to mitigate the risk, but I guess, switching hats, as a member of the community, well, Hawaiian Electric is trying to be best in class for wildfire mitigation. And I think if we all do our part and try to make our homes and our places of business and our communities safer, that Hawaii as a state can also be best in class.
So what I would offer is be willing to challenge assumptions, be willing to challenge legacy approaches. So there's a lot of, I think I already just mentioned that, we can do this. There's the hope, right? I think we're already proving that there's technology out there, there's willingness to change ways of working to be able to build, operate, and maintain a system that doesn't cause ignitions that cause catastrophic fire. I think that, so the intent is there, and it's really being able to be creative and challenge one's own assumptions, organizational cultural norms, to shift in a way to get back to what Chair Asuncion said in terms of speed, to be able to move quickly to address that risk.
Excellent. I want to thank the three of you for such a grounded conversation. It has been a real pleasure sharing the stage with you, and thank you for sharing your voices. Help me thank them with a little bit of applause.